Good afternoon. It's Monday, June 28th, and this interview was taken on June the 29th, 1937. So that would have been 84 years ago tomorrow. And it's the Reverend W.B. Allen, ex-slave. It was taken in Columbus, Georgia. Reverend Allen lived at 425 2nd Avenue. In the second interview, the submission of which was voluntarily sought by myself, this very interesting specimen of a rapidly vanishing type expressed a desire to amend his previous interview of May 10th, 1937 to incorporate the following facts. For a number of years before freedom, my father bought his time from his master and traveled about over Russell County, Alabama as a journeyman blacksmith, doing work for various planters and making good money. So winning those days on the side. At the close of the war, however, he has a trunk full of Confederate money. All of that good money was gone. Father could neither read nor write, but had a good head for figures and was very pious. His life had a wonderful influence upon me, though I was originally worldly, that is, I drank and cussed, but haven't touched a drop of spirits in 40 years and quit cussing before I entered the ministry in 1879. I learned to pray then very young and kept it up even in my unsaved days. My white master knew me to be a praying boy and asked me in 1865, when the South was about whipped and General Wilson was headed our way, to pray to God to hold the Yankees back. Of course, I didn't have any love for any Yankee, and I haven't now for that matter, but I told my white folks straight from the shoulder that I could not pray along those lines. I told them flat-footedly that while I loved them and would do any reasonable praying for them, I could not pray against my conscience. That I not only wanted to be free, but I wanted to see all the Negroes freed. Then I told them that God was using the Yankees to scourge the slaveholders just as he had centuries before, using heathens and outcasts to chastise his chosen people, the children of Israel. Here it is noted that for a slave boy of between approximately 15 and 17 years of age, remarkably familiarity with the Old Testament was displayed. The parson then entered into a mild tirade against the Yankees, saying the only time the northern people ever helped the nigger was when they freed him. They are not friends of the Negro, and many a time from my pulpit have I warned niggers about going north. No, sir, the colored man doesn't belong in the North, has no business up there, and you may tell the world that the Reverend W.B. Allen makes nothing about saying that. He also says that if it wasn't for the influence of the white race in the South, the Negro race would revert to savagery within a year. Why, if they knew for a dead certain that there was not a policeman or officer of the law in Columbus tonight, the good Lord only knows what they do tonight. Then the good parson had delivered himself as quoted. He was asked a few questions, the answers to which, as shall follow, disclose their nature. The lowest down whites of slavery days were the average overseers. A few were gentlemen, one must admit, but the regular run of them were trash, commoner than poor white trash, and if possible, their children were worse than their daddies. The name overseer was a synonym for slave driver, cruelty, brutishness. No, sir, a nigger may be humble and refuse to talk outside his race because he's afraid to, but you can't fool him about a white man. And you couldn't fool him when he was a slave. He knows the white man for what he is, and he knew him the same way in slavery times. Concerning the punishment of slaves, the Reverend says, I never heard or knew of a slave being tried in a court of anything. I never knew of a slave being guilty of any crime more serious than taking something or violating plantation rules. And the only punishment I'd ever heard of or knew of being administered slaves was whipping. I've personally known a few slaves that were beaten to death for one or more of the following offenses: leaving home without a pass, talking back or sassing a white person, hitting another Negro, fussing, fighting, and rusking in the quarters, lying, loitering on their work, taking things the whites called it stealing. Plantation rules forbid a slave to own a firearm, leave home without a pass, sell or buy anything without his master's consent, marry without his owner's consent, have a light on his cabin after a certain hour at night, attend a secret meeting, harbor or in any manner assist a runaway slave, abuse a farm animal, mistreat a member of his family, and do a great many other things. When asked if he had ever heard slaves plot an insurrection, the person answered in the negative. When asked if he had personal knowledge of an instance of a slave offering resistance to corporal punishment, the Reverend shook his head, but said, sometimes a stripped nigger would say some hard things to the white man with the strap in his hand, though he knew that he, the Negro, would pay for it dearly. For when the slave showed spirit that way, the master or overseer laid the lash on all the harder. When asked how women took their whippings, he said they usually screamed and prayed, though a few never made a sound. The parson had two wives and 5 children. Both wives and 3 of his children are dead. He is also superannuated, but occasionally does a little preaching, having only recently been down to Montezere, Georgia on a special call to deliver a message to the Methodist flocks there. Jack Atkinson, ex-slave. Once a man, twice a child, quoted Jack Atkinson, a gray-haired darky, when being interviewed. And I done started in my second childhood. I used to be active as a cat, but I ain't so no more. Jack acquired his surname from his white master, Mr. Atkinson, who owned this little Negro family prior to the war between the states. He was a little boy during the war, but remembers refugeeing to Griffin from Butte County, Georgia, with the Atkinsons when Sherman passed by their home on his march to the sea. Jack's father, Tom, the body servant of Mr. Atkinson, took care of him the 4 years that they were away at war. Many's the time I done heard my daddy tell about biting his hands. He was so hungry, and he and the master drinking water out of the ruts of the road. They were so thirsty during the war. Boss man, Mr. Atkinson, was a fine man as ever broke bread, according to Jack. When he asked how he got married, he stated that he broke off a love vine and throwed it over the fence, and if it growed, he would get married. The vine just growed, and it wasn't long before he and Lucy married. A hoot owl is the show sign of rain, and the screech owl means the death for a fact. A tree frog's holler is a true sign of rain. Jack maintains that he has received a second blessing from the Lord, and no conjurer can bother him. Jack Atkinson, Route D, Griffin, Georgia, interviewed August 21st, 1936. And finally, ex-town slave. Hannah Austin. When the writer was presented to Miss Hannah Austin, she was immediately impressed with her alert, youthful appearance. Miss Austin is well preserved for her age and speaks clearly with much intelligence. The interview was brief but an interesting one. This was partly due to the fact that Miss Austin was a small child when the Civil War ended, and two because her family was classed as town slaves. Miss Austin was a child of 10 or 12 years when the war ended. She doesn't know her exact age, but estimated it between 70 and 75 years. She was born the oldest child of Liza and George Hall. Their master, Frank Hall, was kind to them and considerate in his treatment of them. Briefly, Miss Austin gave him the following account of slavery as he knew it, as she knew it. My family lived in a 2-room, well-built house which had many windows and a large porch. Our master, Mr. Hall, was a merchant and operated a clothing store. Because Mr. Hall lived in town, he did not need but a few slaves. My family, which included my mother, father, sister, and myself, were his only servants. Originally, Mr. Hall did not own any slaves. However, after marrying Mrs. Hall, we were given to her by her father as part of her inheritance. My mother nursed Mrs. Hall from a baby. Consequently, the Hall family was very fond of her and often made the statement that they would not part with her for anything in the world. Besides working as a cook for the family, my mother was also the fine seamstress and made clothing for the master's family and our family. We were allowed an ample amount of good clothing, which Mr. Hall selected from the stock in his store. My father worked as a porter in the store and did other jobs around the house. I did not have to work and spent most of my time playing with the Hall children. We were considered the better class of slaves and did not know the meaning of a hard time. Other slave owners whipped their slaves severely and often, but I had never known our master to whip anyone of my family. If anyone in the family became ill, the family doctor was called in as often as he was needed. We did not have churches of our own, but were allowed to attend the white churches in the afternoon. The white families attended in the forenoon. We seldom heard a true religious sermon, but we were constantly preached the doctrine of obedience to our masters and mistresses. We were required to attend church every Sunday. Marriages were conducted in the same manner as they are today. After the usual courtship, a minister was called in by the master and the marriage ceremony would take place. In my opinion, people of today are more lax in their attitude towards marriage than they were in those days. Following the marriage of a slave couple, a celebration would take place. Often the master and his family would take part in the celebration. I remember hearing my mother and father discuss the war, but was too young to know just the effect the war would have on a slave. One day I remember Mr. Hall coming to telling my mother, telling her she was free. His exact words were, quote, "Liza, you don't belong to me any longer, you belong to yourselves. If you are hired now, I will have to pay you. I do not want you to leave, as you have a house here as long as you live." I watched my mother to see the effect his words would have on her, and I saw her eyes filled with tears. Mr. Hall's eyes were filled with tears also. Soon after this incident, a Yankee army appeared in our village one day. They practically destroyed Mr. Hall's store by throwing all the clothes and other merchandise into the streets. Seeing my sister and I, they turned to us saying, "Little Negroes, you are free. There are no more masters and mistresses. Help yourself to these clothes, take them home with you." Not knowing any better, we carried stockings, socks, dresses, underwear, and many other pieces home. After this, they opened the smokehouse door and told us to go in and take all the meat we wanted. On another occasion, the mistress called me, asking that I come in the yard to play with the children. Here, Mrs. Austin began to laugh and remarked I did not go, but politely told I was free and didn't belong to anyone but my mama and papa. As I spoke these words, my mistress began to cry. My mother and father continued to live with the Halls even after freedom and until their deaths. Although not impoverished, most of the Hall's fortune was wiped out with the war. Mrs. Austin married at the age of 16 and was the mother of 4 children, all of whom are dead. She was very ambitious and was determined to get education as much was possible. After the war, northern white people came south and set up schools for education of Negroes. She remembers the organization of the old Stowe School, from which one of the present Negro colleges originated. Miss Austin proudly spoke of her old blue-back speller, which she still possesses in of the days when she attended Stowe schools. As the writer made ready to depart, Miss Austin smilingly informed her that she had told her all that she knew about slavery, and every word spoken was the truth. And that's again the end of my reading of our devotional memories of the words of former slaves. Thank you. This is the Black Man Who Reads Aloud, the Black Blogger, www.joesmokethoughts.com.